Hello, I am Matt Williamson and I'm back with another Beatle album review. Now, as you know, I started working on a lot of the United States album versions. And the reason I wanted to do that is because, well, many of us grew up with those versions and we love them. And with all these remixes going on in recent months, you know, a lot of people have said, well, I like what I grew up listening to, and that's kind of my default. And I think that's pretty normal. And the thing of it is over the many years in the CD age forward, the United States, or some of the non-British versions, have been downplayed and denigrated, really, and considered to be inferior to the British versions. And I think that most people that bought these and had these in the United States when they were young didn't care about that. And comparing them now, it's always good to go back. I think these deserve a little more discussion, and I think they are much more valuable than we're given credit for from the CD age forward. So that's why I want to do these reviews. And we're going to talk about A Hard Day's Night. And the reason this album is, I think, extra special, this is a legitimate soundtrack. And this was not released on Capitol, so it's on United Artists and is a little bit unique for a lot of reasons connected with the film. So first of all, this album was released 2 weeks before the British counterpart, which is this one, and about a week and a half before the film. The United Artists was very anxious to get this out, and we'll talk about why that was in a moment. But one of the things that is interesting is that the Beatles started shooting this film about 3.5 weeks after they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. So things are moving awfully fast for these guys. This deal was already in the works in late 1963. So this had been really set in motion in a big way before they even hit the shores of the United States. And this album is a Lennon-McCartney tour de force. And one of the things that makes this album sound much more of an advancement than the first two albums is the fact there are no cover songs on this record. There are no 50s rock and roll songs. This is all Lennon-McCartney originals, and that makes it a very modern sounding record. This is the new age of rock. One of the things that made the sound so fresh was George Harrison's 12-string Rickenbacker guitar. The 12-string electric was not brand new. I mean, the Searchers used it a little bit, but the Beatles really took it further on this record in making it a very integral part of their sound. One of the things that makes this soundtrack interesting is the involvement of George Martin. Now, he typically gets brought up more in the Revolver, Sgt. Pepper era, the more psychedelic era where there's a lot more crazy things going on with production, but really he offered a great deal on this soundtrack. 4 songs he completely arranged and orchestrated based on Lennon-McCartney songs, and he doesn't get a lot of credit for that, but it really, if you like soundtracks, and this is a legitimate soundtrack, it's really kind of fun. It's very much a period piece if you listen to it with those songs in there, and it's really a great listen. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up, the title, A Hard Day's Night, I mean, many of us know the story. It was a Ringo malapropism that he was sitting around, the Beatles were working all day, and I think he meant to say it's been a hard day's work, but realizing it was night, he said it's been a hard day's night. So that worked its way into John Lennon's In His Own Right book, and it must have gotten brought up because Richard Lester really liked it and wanted that to be the title of the movie. So Lennon-McCartney had to write a song to order, which is also pretty amazing, and is mainly a John Lennon song. Now, the working title of this album was originally to be Beatlemania, and that was probably a word that had been used a lot in the press, and I don't think Lester ever wanted to use that, but it could have been used. But here we see a phrase being coined by Ringo. This is a completely original phrase, and not written by Lennon-McCartney, but written by Ringo, and that becomes the title. So from top to bottom, this album and film is really rather groundbreaking. All right, let's talk about the songs now. Now, we really can't talk about this album, I think, without first talking about the British release, which had 13 tracks on it. As I mentioned, all Lennon-McCartney originals. And side 1 of this album was to be all the songs in the film. Side 2 were just additional songs. But the American version only had 8 original songs on this, plus 4 of the instrumentals I had mentioned. Those were scored by George Martin, and those are sprinkled throughout both sides. Usually the Beatle albums were always 14 tracks. There was a 14th track planned, but Ringo got tonsillitis, and the session that they had booked for that, they ended up using to audition Jimmy Nicol to go on tour with them in the place of Ringo briefly while he recovered. So that's why this album only has 13 tracks. But we're going to talk about what's on the American version. So the songs that were omitted on the American version were Anytime at All, Things We Said Today, You Can't Do That, I'll Be Back, and When I Get Home. That left us with only 8 songs and then 4 instrumentals. So why did these have instrumentals on them and not in the British version? Well, here's what happened. When Capitol was negotiating or trying to not release the Beatles, which is an interesting story in and of itself. You have a company, Capitol, whose parent company was EMI in England, and they didn't get along very well. So there was some pushback when the Beatles hit. They didn't really want to give the Brits any credit. This meant that Capitol was to drop the ball several times during this whole Beatles launch, and this soundtrack deal was one of them. So United Artists, who was doing the film, they had a very lucrative soundtrack business. And you had Henry Mancini's work was selling well, the James Bond, Dr. No sold great. So you had soundtracks that were really starting to be very good moneymakers. So United Artists essentially got the deal for a 3-picture deal with the Beatles before Capitol even knew what was going on. So that's why this album is released on United Artists and not Capitol. This also meant that United Artists got some of the publishing on this release. But Capitol, again, was asleep at the wheel, and for some reason, there wasn't a soundtrack release in the UK. I'm not sure why that was, but EMI was just going to release this as is, so they didn't feel a need maybe for a soundtrack to compete with it. So United Artists really didn't think this film was going to do anything. They figured this is just another quickie, whatever the hot band is, let's make a quick buck on a film, we'll make money on the soundtrack. That was their plan, because they had an understanding of selling records. The film they thought was going to be a loss leader for them. And, obviously Capitol has the biggest band in the world, and they're completely oblivious to all of this. So credit to United Artists for landing that. And that opened up some opportunities for George Martin, like I said before. Fans were treated to a preview of the soundtrack with the release of Can't Buy Me Love in March 1964, and this was just at the height of just after the Sullivan appearance, and they could do no wrong. And the great thing about the Beatles releases at this time is you've got a McCartney lead song out with Can't Buy Me Love, and that's followed by A Hard Day's Night a couple months later with John Lennon mainly singing lead. So you've got this great variety, and again, you've got A Hard Day's Night, one of the great opening chords of all time, just to kick off the song and kick off the film. So you have all these exciting songs to go with an already exciting film.
Can't buy me love, love. It's been a hard day's night. A love like ours could never die.
All these singles were clogging the American charts, and they were competing against other Beatles singles too, because VJ was releasing singles. You might have had a couple Capitol singles in there too, but nonetheless, these all really scored very high. And I Love Her only was number 10, but that was after 2 number 1s in a row.
If I give my heart to you, I should have known better. I think I love you too. I'm so happy when you dance with me.
I Should Have Known Better is one of the main songs I identify this movie by, and great song. Could have probably been its own single. If I Fell, a great ballad. And then you've got George singing I'm Happy Just to Dance With You. And finally you have Tell Me Why, the kind of sleeper rocker on this album. Now there's one other song on the record that's called I'll Cry Instead. And this was unique because, first of all, it was supposed to be in the film and was cut. And the American version has an extra verse in it, making it quite a bit longer than the British counterpart.
I'm gonna have myself away, but I'll come back again someday.
Okay, this brings us to the instrumentals by George Martin. On the back, each song it's listed as either a vocal or instrumental, so that'll tell you which ones are which. And the George Martin songs, they're very different sounding. And let's start with Ringo's theme, This Boy. And this is the famous scene Ringo didn't have a song to sing on this album, but he got the most beefy part in the film and did a great job. And he right away figured that he was going to continue to act because this went over so well. And this song, the George Martin version, was issued as a single, got to number 53 in the States, but all the way to number 1 in Canada. Now, like I said before, these are very period sounding. It sounds very much like early mid-60s soundtrack work, and I just love it. I mean, I never listened to these much when I was younger, and I've only begun to listen to it more as I'm older and as I get more into 60s soundtracks anyway. So this kind of music, I'm often in the mood for it. So I really like it. And even this version of Hard Day's Night, which is super jazzy, he took it pretty far, farther than I thought he would. So those 4 instrumentals seldom get talked about. And they're kind of fun. I think, and those of you who listened to the soundtrack originally probably have a hard time not hearing those juxtaposed in between some of the other hits. Now, there were 3 other songs from the film that were not on the record, on either record, but they're just snippets of songs that are used in dance scenes and whatnot, and that's I Want to Be Your Man, Don't Bother Me, and All My Lovin'. Now, one thing I want to talk about now is the artwork and the 2 different covers, because these are drastically different covers. And I would say that the British version has a much more artistic feel that really matches the style of the film. It's like film strips here that when we see this used in the film where they're taking photos with the camera and you can hear the film advancing. Really cool effect. This doesn't have the sprocket holes on the side of the film strip, but you get the same feeling. So I think this is a much more artistic cover. This cover, a lot more commercial. I'm really surprised. I don't know whose idea it was to use the half heads. That was completely original so far as I know. And I think it's much more impactful. I think it became an iconic cover. This is certainly more commercial. The film strips were used on the back, and I think they stand out a little bit more than with the blue background on the British version. And of course we see the stylized type from the film, which is a little more cartoony, which does fit the whole soundtrack motif anyway. So you don't see that. This is a little more stuffy here on the British version. So I prefer the North American version to the British. It's just more fun. I find it more impactful, and a little extra bonus because I grew up listening to it. Now, one thing I like to do when I do these reviews are talk about, well, what could have they done better? I mean, the Beatles are not perfect. There's maybe something that could have been done a little bit better. This is one album, it's really hard for me to pick apart because of all the originals, as I said, the fresh sound made such by George Harrison's guitar work. And the songs are just fun. I think the film helps sell the songs. It just gives them more excitement and more vitality. So I don't think I would change much. It was surprising that the critics unanimously praised it, both the film and the album. And this was a time before there was an underground rock press. There really wasn't a rock press. There was just, music critique. And for them to praise it so much really caught, there was something going on here that they were picking up on this buzz. And after all this time, these songs still stand the test of time and still sound very fresh. And so I think they were onto something there. Critic Andrew Saris wrote that one of the most glowing reviews, calling it the Citizen Kane of jukebox musicals. A Hard Day's Night hit #1 in the United States and was there for 14 weeks, completing the longest run of any album that year, so even more than Meet the Beatles. So this album really was a huge hit, and when it trumps Meet the Beatles, Beatlemania was still on the upswing. Now this album had 4 million in sales, and this was the album that Capitol passed on, or didn't even think to acquire the rights to. And the film, which only cost about $500,000 to make, that made $11 million. This album still sounds exciting to me, and even though I wasn't around to follow the Beatles in real time, this album is so good that it makes me feel like I was actually there. So if you haven't heard this version, give it a spin. I mean, it's going to be a whole new listening experience for you, and it'll put you back in that 60s, mid-60s soundtrack vibe, if you will, that I really love, so you may like it too. Well, that's it for today. I do have a Patreon subscription if you want to donate to this channel in a bigger way. And if you don't want to do that, just hit subscribe. That helps me as well. I've got some merchandise below that I can set you up with, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on Pop Goes the 60s.